Okay, welcome to the final topic that we're going to be covering in 7th grade this year on evolution. This is a 44 slide PowerPoint that I'm going to break down by different objectives. So we're just going to cover objective number 1 today. And hopefully I'm going to narrate this in a way that will make it a little bit easier to understand. The first objective is to describe evolution and identify evidence of evolution. I think it's important to know this is somewhat controversial in some places, but we look at the evidence of evolution, and we know that the Earth is about 4.6 billion years old. We know that life began almost 3 billion years ago, and this doesn't mean that we descended from apes or that sort of thing. But anyway, we're going to get into this, and you can see the evidence as to why scientists believe in evolution. All right, evolution is a change in the frequency of genes within a population. If you remember from our discussion on genetics, that we're made up of all kinds of traits because of our DNA, and we have alleles that define those traits. But anytime we have a change in the gene pool, then we start to have evolution. Now, a population is all the individuals of a species that live in an area, just like all the jackrabbits that may live in Utah County, or all the 7th graders that are at Renaissance Academy. Now, variation is an important concept. It says on the slide the heritable differences that exist in a population. Heritable means you inherit them from your biological parents, half from your mother, half from your father. And those organisms that have asexual reproduction, they wind up cloning themselves. An adaptation is a variation that allows an individual to survive better than others. I'm going to get rid of this little picture of me, I think. But for example, if there are antelope that can run faster than others, they survive. They escape the cheetahs and whatever other prey happen to be out there, and those that aren't as fast wind up, becoming food. And therefore, their genes are not going to go into the next generation. So there are any number of things, things that are camouflaged so that they aren't as noticeable. And then finally, we have a mutation. Mutations also can result in evolution. Things that are asexual, that is basically the only way that they're going to evolve, because basically they make clones of themselves. Sorry about that. Hopefully this thing is going to go fairly smoothly, but sometimes you get interrupted, especially when you're doing things at home. But anyway, so we're talking about evidences for evolution, and we said that an adaptation helps an organism survive in something that's inherited, and they could include body structures, any number of different things. So that's kind of a repeat of what I just said. Other evidence. Whenever you have these changes in the gene pool, they become permanent. Because when for whatever reason, your DNA changes, and it does, then I keep getting interruptions. I apologize. But anyway, it becomes permanent because DNA replicates itself. And then as the only time the DNA gets mixed up is when you have half the DNA or half the chromosomes from one parent and half from the other, and then you start to get a mix. And if they create adaptations that allow them to survive, then over time they're going to continue to change. And remember that individuals can evolve. We can have adaptations that give us an opportunity to be more successful than another member of our species, but only populations can evolve, and that happens, of course, over time. The creature that you see right here is the Eohippus. The Eohippus is an ancestor of what modern animal? And the answer to that is the horse. The Eohippus existed 60 million years ago, so the ancestors to the horse 60 million years ago was the Eohippus, which was much, much smaller. Then 20 million years later became the Meohippus, and then another 15 years, the Merocohippus, and then the Pleohippus, and finally the Equus, which is the modern horse that we have of today. And we'll talk about how we know that they're ancestors. You need to understand that evolution is a branching process. So diversity means variety. We talk about variation. Diversity is basically the same thing. We have things that are different, kind of like when you go to a buffet, such as Chuck-A-Rama, they have a variety of different foods. You can't eat everything, but you have a choice of salads, you have a choice of meats, you have a choice of vegetables, desserts, etc. So there is a variety, and the more variety, the greater the opportunity for things to change. And anyway, scientists believe that things have common ancestors, and that's why when we look at how we classify different species, we're Homo sapiens. And if you look at different evolutionary steps towards that, there are other, what we call upright bipeds, and we won't go into a lot of that, but basically you need to understand that we look at this branching process, and we look at similarities among the cells that show that we have a common ancestor. And so we have a common ancestor, us and the primates. And, house cats and lions and tigers all have a common ancestor, and at some point in time it branched off. Now, the thing that we find out in general is that all cells have a cell membrane. Plants, animals, bacteria, fungi, they all have cell membranes. And let me get rid of this, see if that shows better. And we use similar forms of cellular respiration. We're finding now in the deep sea vents, where there is no light but life exists, that we're finding out that instead of having photosynthesis, we have chemosynthesis. And so as we learn more about this, we're going to find out that there are even greater variations than we thought of. And then finally, every living thing, whether it's at the deep sea vent or whether, it's found in the Antarctic, all life has basically, as its form of structure, has DNA. And that's significant. So as I was saying, evolution is a branching process. Let me get rid of my picture again. And you can see that there's a common ancestor that both a frog and a snake have. And then as you move up this line, this evolutionary line, then you wind up having a common ancestor here for a kangaroo and a squirrel. They're both mammals. Kangaroo is a special mammal called the marsupial. And this shows over time. So, an ancestor is an organism from which others have descended, just like your grandparents are your ancestors, your great-great-grandparents go back one more generation, and so on and so forth. And you'll find out that over the millennia that we look a whole lot different than we did perhaps, 1,000 years ago. Not that we have pictures from going that far back, but we have certainly changed. Homo sapiens as a species we're taller. We have more muscles, and I won't go into a whole discussion of anatomy and physiology, but we have changed over the millennia. Anyway, this thing is called a cladogram. You need to know that term and what a cladogram is. but it shows the evolutionary relationships between all of these living species and their ancestors. Here's a life timeline that you can look at that kind of shows, when the Earth formed 4.5 to 4.6 billion years ago, and when the very first life forms came, and so on and so forth, all the way until we have man. There are some other videos that are going to be available in this lesson that will talk about, how life got started. And if they condensed a timeline into 24 hours, you'd find out we've only been around for a few seconds, but very important few seconds. Again, continuing the lines of evidence, sometimes we're talking about looking at physical structures. So we have analogous structures, and you're going to need to know this term, which means we evolved separately, but they perform the same function. So a bird wing and a moth wing both help them to fly, but moths have a much different evolutionary development. They, are basically insects, and birds are, are animals or vertebrates, which means they have a backbone, but they're in their own category as a bird as opposed to a mammal. So, some of the lines of evidence include comparative anatomy. We look to see how we're similar to other things. How are we similar to chimpanzees? How are we similar to cats? How are we similar to frogs? Obviously, we have a great more in common with apes and chimpanzees than we do with frogs or snakes, but we do have some similarities. So we do comparative anatomy. We also analyze the DNA, and I'll show you a slide here in a minute that will talk to you about similarities in the DNA of just one particular trait. We have fossils, and we're going to talk more about fossils in just a minute. That shows at least what our bone structure looked like, a very long time ago. So continuing lines of evidence, comparative anatomy is one of those where we compare the anatomical similarities and differences. What makes two species similar, what makes them very different. So the question that I would be asking you if you were in class is, what does your arm have in common with the wing of a bird, the flipper of a porpoise, and the forelimb or the front leg of an elephant? Analogous structures serve the same function but come from different origins. All right, what we're going to be doing here is talking about homologous structure. They have a common origin. In other words, we have similar ancestor or the same ancestor, but they don't perform the same function. So you need to know this term, analogous structure and homologous structure. So let's give and of course there's DNA evidence. That's probably the most precise thing that we have now, but DNA wasn't even discovered until the 1950s. And then we didn't really know what to do with the information until probably after 1980 when we started the Human Genome Project. Okay, so let's look at homologous structures. Homo meaning the same, which means they may have had the same ancestors. So if you look at a human and you look at the bone structure, look how similar they are. To a bird, you have a similar bone structure, but it's a wing versus an arm. And then a porpoise flipper, again, if you look at the bone structure, is very similar. Different shapes certainly, but the arrangement is similar. And then finally an elephant's foreleg. So this indicates that somewhere back, millions or hundreds of millions of years ago, we had a common ancestor and we all went in different directions. All right, here's what we call embryology. We look at the embryos of different things. And so if we look at the vertebrates, which are animals with a backbone, you have a fish, a calf, which is, a baby cow, and a rabbit. And you can see they're fairly similar. Of course, they grow up to be very different looking. However, as we compare these, we find out that as adults, they have many similarities in their skeletons and in their muscles. So there are certainly similarities between a fish and a rabbit that you wouldn't think of until you go back and you look at their initial development. So we call this embryonic evidence. All right. Now we're going to look at DNA. We're going to compare the DNA of a human to a chimpanzee, a dog, a bird, a frog, and an eel, keeping in mind that this is just one trait. It's for the gene for hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is the chemical organ, or it's the chemical that's in red blood cells that allow them to carry oxygen to all your cells. So this doesn't mean, that we're close in everything, but you can see the hemoglobin in a chimpanzee is much more similar than a dog, a bird, a frog, or an eel. So this is one way we can find out what we have in common. And overall, we have something like 95% of the same DNA as chimpanzees do. They're our nearest biological relative. Now we look at fossils, and it's important to understand fossils can be a footprint, it can be a skeleton or a leaf imprint that gets embedded in the Earth's crust. So this is kind of how it happens. An organism dies. It gets covered. If it doesn't get covered, then it's subject to being damaged by wind, by natural elements, by predators that bite off chunks and carry them off. And as more and more sediment covers the organism, and there's more pressure over time, eventually what's left is the hard structures, which is the bones, and then secondly the cartilage, but mostly the bones. Then after a while, there's a process where those organic compounds are replaced by minerals. We call that mineralization. And so we get fossils. If you look at the fossil record, it's pretty simple. The stuff that's on the top is newer than the ones that are much deeper. So the fossils that we find closer to the surface of the Earth are the newer species. The ones that are deeper are the older ancestors. And so if we go back to the Eohippus, which is that, baby horse from 60 million years ago, when we look at footprints and stuff, you can see how it's changed gradually over 60 million years